Okay, everybody, thank you for coming back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John Andrews, but as always, you can just call me PJ. Well, today with me, I'm excited to say I have a guest who I think probably, if you're in the history podcast world or a fan of history in general, probably needs no introduction. I have Daniele Bolelli, who is the host of the History on Fire podcast. He writes here on Substack. And I would say you're probably like, to me, one of the OGs of the history podcast world. Like you, Dan Carlin, and like Mike Duncan are like the Led Zeppelin, Stones, and the Beatles. So with that having been said, I think that's a decent introduction. But if the audience is maybe not aware of you, do you want to say just a little bit about yourself and your background and your writing?
Sure. I grew up in Italy, moved to the United States when I was about 18 years old. I've been living here ever since. I teach history in college for a few universities in California. I've written a few books, been podcasting since 2012. So those are some of the primary things I've been playing with. Of course, there's, a never-ending list of stuff I could go on, but I think this provides the basics at least.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. You've done some really, really great series in the past, particularly like the Crazy Horse one and the one on the Slave Wars gives a lot of great context. But I guess the reason I invited you on is because recently you made a really interesting post on Substack where you talked about the Italian years of lead.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, I wanted to have you on to talk about that a little bit because, there's been a lot of very crazy things that have been happening in the news right now. And I see a lot of people, both, more on the right and the left, who are using a lot of language that is, and I always use that Dan Carlin line, like, I'm not a historian, I'm just a fan of history, but using language and either saying, this is a call for revolution, or, I'm referring to political commentator Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated a few days ago. And this is a part of a much larger, at least in my view, trend of violence in the United States right now, political violence. And I think, when I hear these people talk about revolution and a lot of, either I would say praising or calling for more political violence. And I think you don't really, I think a lot of these people don't understand really what this is going to entail. Yeah. And I think that's why I wanted to have you on, because that's where you grew up there. And also you've written about it, the Italian years of lead, and maybe talk a little bit about that in your experience, hopefully, so we can, give people a little bit of insight on, it's not as fun or exciting maybe as like some people like to imagine.
Not even close. I think the only people who can think in those terms are people who are LARPing and are living in their fantasies of what civil war in the name of the good principles is all about. There's nothing cool about it. There's never been, there never will in those kind of context, especially because if in a conventional war you may have a quote-unquote winner, even that gets messy, but it's a little more likely when you have a clash between countries with armies and stuff. When you're talking about these tit for tat for political murders, absolutely no one wins. It's not a situation where anybody comes out well. And if by some miracle somebody feels that their side is winning for a really short period of time, it's pretty much guaranteed by the forces of history that the wheel will turn, and eventually the ones who are winning are going to be squashed and vice versa. So this is a game that really doesn't benefit anyone in any way, shape, or form. I'll actually have an episode on the years of lead, not covering the whole thing because it's an insane mess of 10,000 events and they get really complicated, but at least painting the big picture and then focusing on one particular story that took place in my hometown. But yeah, just to give a little bit of background for people who may not be familiar, the years of lead were a period in Italy from the late 1960s. Some people put the beginning around 67, some people 69, is somewhere around there, late 60s to early to mid 80s. Some people say early 80s. I know people I know some folks whose relatives were gunned down still in 85. So, it doesn't end all in one day, kind of fizzles out. But roughly by the mid 80s is when it's really done. So that's smack in the period in which I was born. I was born in 1974. So all my early childhood was lived that way. It's probably only by the time I hit my teenage years that the years of lead ended. And it's an insane period in the sense that what you have at the time is it basically like you have to go back almost to the end of World War II. Because what happened at the end of World War II is that many people have this idea that fascism ended when Mussolini was executed, and then that's the end of it all. It's not. In what I consider an atrocious decision, the leader of the Communist Party in Italy, Palmiro Togliatti, brokered an amnesty that essentially forgave all kind of crimes for all political crimes for both partisans and fascists during World War II, which allowed a lot of, which essentially allowed fascism to survive. And not only to survive, but allowed fascism to start infiltrating the post-World War II Italian state. So much so that by the 1960s, you had people who very strongly wanted a return to fascism, who were in the police forces, were in secret services, in the army, among some politicians. And the way it worked out is that because the 1960s are beginning to tilt way too much to the left for their liking, both in terms of cultural transformations, laws that are being passed, the student movements, and things like that. Some of the more extreme on the fascist side of the spectrum decide to start a campaign of terror that is designed to create a climate of instability throughout the country, of fear, that would make the general population freak out and be willing to give power to whoever promises a restoration of law and order. In other words, they would start a campaign of terror so that their guys could then step up being the ones, we are going to stop it all, don't worry, we're going to fix this. And it was basically a way to have a more or less either a direct coup or an indirect one, but basically to seize power and bring fascism back through terrorism, through staging this campaign of terror through this time. Now, in an ideal world, you would do it through false flag operations so that it could be blamed on their political opponents. In a less ideal world, of course, they get busted every other time that they are the ones behind it, but it still works because the idea is to create such fear and instability that if another one of them who have kept the legal face of the movement comes in and say, I'll restore law and order, hopefully the population will go along with it. So it begins with, like the one incident I'll focus this episode on is in 1969 in Milan, in my hometown. A bomb went off in this bank, just a 5-minute walk away from the Duomo, which is the main church in the center of town. The bomb killed 17 people, wounded almost 100. And this was just one of the big events. But there will be, literally at one point they counted, in a space of 5 years, there are 5,000 terrorist attacks. Not all on this scale, of course, but even up to, fast forward 11 years, and in 1980, there's this huge bombing in the Bologna train station that kills almost 100 people and wounds many more. This becomes the norm. So as this becomes the norm, you have people on the left who decide to get armed and start their own violent organizations, like the Red Brigades, for example, started kidnapping politicians, shooting judges, doing all this kind of stuff. So now you have both a right-wing and left-wing terrorism. You have people on the street, activists, who just are regularly beating the hell out of each other at every other circumstances, waiting for each other down the street from somebody's house, carrying out hits, more or less lethal, depending. And this is an ongoing, constant thing. You basically cannot go to a political demonstrations without violence. Violence becomes the language spoken across the board by everybody. So, as you may imagine, this is not a particularly pleasant scenario. Now, both sides. Now, when I say both sides, is also stupid because, of course, this is an extreme faction on the right, and there will be an extreme faction on the left. There's a ton of people on the left and on the right that don't want that. So again, when we paint it as left wing versus right wing, we're way oversimplifying the situation because there are many, many, many variations of the people on the right and on the left, and not all of them have the same ideas. Far from it. More often than not, they end up shooting each other within their movement before they even shoot the ones on the other side. So again, I don't want to oversimplify, but basically you're going to have the extreme factions on both sides. They all think that the violence is going to work out for them. The right-wingers think that the terrorism is going to bring in a fascist coup. The left-wingers think that there's going to be a proletarian revolution. Both of them are delusional because neither will happen. The longer the conflict continues, the more fascists realize that the population is definitely not going to fall for the let's turn to these guys for law and order. And people like the Red Brigades will find out that with each action, they start losing support. And, whereas some people are maybe supportive initially where they were kidnapping somebody who was clearly cracking down on leftist movements, before you know it, they're like, okay, these guys are getting crazy and trigger happy and they're doing stupid, violent stuff. And so both sides are gonna kill a lot of people only to realize that their strategy is leading nowhere. It's just leading to killing more people. And you hit them, they hit you, more people die. Are you any closer to getting what you wanted politically? Absolutely not. Takes them, unfortunately, a really long time to figure it out. Eventually, by the mid-80s, terrorism will fizzle out because it's not leading anywhere. It's not helping anybody. It just killed a whole bunch of people without any real outcome that's desirable for any faction. So that's an extremely shortened version of the story. Now, part of what makes it extra weird is that the fascist terrorism wasn't done just by some crazy guys. It was done with the support of at least some sections of the secret services. And incidentally, those sections of the secret services were financed by the CIA. So it gets a little shady on multiple levels, but that's an extremely oversimplified version of the years of lead.
Mm-hmm. And that's it's one of those things where I would like to dig into it more in the near future. And I'm, over this last week, I've just been, it's one of those phrases, I hear it's almost become a meme, like, the American years of lead.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where until fairly recently, like I kind of didn't really, I don't want to say I didn't take it seriously, but I saw it as more, if you've heard the term stochastic terrorism. I wrote an article a little while back. It was titled 10,000 Ted Kaczynskis, because that's kind of how I saw it. It was a lot of isolated violence by isolated people who are doing, their own specific, like ideological, whatever it is, that is wrong with their life. They kind of like will all funnel that into a worldview and do some, some sort of violent act on it. Yep. That having been said, the more I start to read about this period in Italy, and I guess, the post-war European period more broadly, it does make me wonder. And without being conspiratorial, only looking at just the facts that are acknowledged, I've heard the phrase strategy of tension used. Yep. And when you talked about the right elements of the Italian government that were in coordination with the CIA, my understanding that's in reference to Operation Gladio, which and again, this is not crazy conspiracy theory. This is declassified now, that the United States in the post-World War II period funded these these former fascists and like a stay behind network, as they called it, to fight if there's any communist agitation. And at least from what I've researched so far, it's controversial to make a direct one-to-one comparison, but at least to me, like I think my policy with this is to try to avoid wild conspiracy theory, but it is okay to, and I would say even necessary, to look at events that are acknowledged and maybe try to make a larger connection that is maybe outside of the official narrative. And when you talk about the eventual results of the years of lead, at least to me, my understanding, the United States was in conflict with the Soviet Union, obviously, and they wanted to keep Italy, obviously, from going to the fascists to the communists, but also kind of keep them in a certain economic zone, because at least to me, what I see as the results is you're playing these disparate elements of the far left and the far right against each other, and the ending was, if whatever you want to call it, like a more standard neoliberal politician is what that order created, and I don't know if you want to speak to that. Is that before we get to like the modern American context, is that a fair understanding of these events?
Absolutely. And I think part of the problem with ideas like Gladio is that if you look at it on paper and somebody tells you, we're setting up something to prevent a Soviet takeover of Italy, I would be the first one to say, hell yeah, absolutely, no problem. That sounds great. The problem is that that's not that's the stated goal, but what it ends up happening is that something like Gladio doesn't become the defense against a Soviet invasion. It becomes something that will crack down on anything that is 1 inch to the left of fascism, which is a very different concept. Saying we are going against communist expansion is one thing. Being against anything that even vaguely a tiny bit on the left of the political spectrum, well, that's a whole different type of priorities. And part of the problem is that, the CIA will intervene in definitely the 1948 election, but probably for about the next 20 plus years, they will muddle just about every single Italian election there is, to the point where, they are trying to make sure that their candidates win and that there's not much that goes in the other direction politically. And I think that's the problem with so much of US foreign policy of that time. That, I did a series at one point of El Salvador in the 1980s. And I understand, actually 70s and 80s. And I understand, if the US foreign policy was, we are involved in the Cold War and we want to prevent the expansion of the Soviet Union, I get that logic. Soviet Union had done horrendous things. I can see the logic behind it. But the problem is that in places like El Salvador of extreme economic, the economy was insane. You had like all the wealth in the hands of like a tiny percentage of the population, most of the people at the brink of starvation. And if anybody just asks, hey, can we get this much more food? Can we get not oppressed to the limit? You would automatically be branded a communist and dealt accordingly. And it's like, those guys are not communists. Those guys are poor peasants trying not to starve. There's a difference. And the moment you treat anybody who's just asking, not even for something wildly revolutionary, but for something slightly more equitable in terms of economics, the moment you brand the most minimal effort at reform as like some communist plot, well, now you created, not only you're doing communism a favor because you're pushing a ton of people that would never go to our communism, you're pushing it straight in their arms by saying there are only two choices. Either our system, which is one that's going to put you at the brink of starvation, or if you're not with us, you're with the communists. But that's a dumb strategy because you're pushing a lot of people in that direction because, of course, they can't accept being on the brink of starvation. But also it's just, you're taking something that could be contained and there would be support for you doing what you want to do. And instead, now you push a lot of people who don't want to be on the other side. You are pushing them to the other side. So in a sense, those policies that are supposedly against communism are actually doing communism the biggest favor possible by not giving people any other choice. And I think that's kind of the problem with Gladio in Italy, that is supposedly an anti-Soviet thing, but it's not. It's an anti-anybody who's not a fascist thing. And that, of course, changes the dynamics quite a bit.
Yeah, and that's something I've seen, especially in the last decade in the United States. There's been, I'm far from the first person to talk about the extreme political polarization that has happened. And I'm somebody who, cards on the table, I was more of like a liberal Bernie Sanders type guy. Became very disenchanted with what the Democratic Party did. Don't necessarily like what the Republicans and Trump are doing. Some of the things that they said on paper, it's like, okay, that would be nice if there was industry coming back to the United States, but let's see what actually happens. And I just say that because I don't want to make it too much about American politics, just for the context of what I see. It's reasonable discussions about things like healthcare or immigration or some of these social things that, like, it feels like, okay, we should be able to have, even within my lifetime. I'm only 33 years old. I've seen, like, reasonable discussion go off the table, and a lot of the it's cliche to say, but the corporate interest, the military industrial complex, that keeps on chugging along. And kind of like you said in regards to how things went in Italy, and I've read a good amount about South America in this time, and it much in the same way, you take out, you'll pump up the either sides of this far left or far right, which I think either drives most people away or more towards the center and just wanting some stability. And even if that stability is not good, like, the horizons of possibility are closed. Because that's something that really struck me when I've been reading about the years of lead in this last week. And I'm somebody who really wants to dig into these topics. So I want to read a lot more, but I remember reading about, talking about Italian people at the time who, like, obviously it was probably traumatizing and a scary time to live in. And if you want to talk about that, I understand if you don't. I'm curious, but I also read people just say, like, they became very numb to violence and just didn't care at a certain point. And I feel like that's where a lot of people have ended up in the United States, or like things like mass shootings or political violence, like, at a certain point stops registering, and that feels like almost more of the danger to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's when you live in that environment, it gets, like, for example, when there was the Bologna bombing in 1980, the one that killed almost 100 people. Yeah, like, my mother took a train from Bologna the day before the bomb went off. This was never something that the violence was never far off. It was always very much within somebody you knew, your friend, your family member, your something. There was always something like this. The city where I grew up in, there were certain side of the city that if you were a left winger, you definitely didn't go. And if you are a right winger, you definitely didn't go into another one, because you'll get beat up in either one. There was this climate that was, violence was everywhere. And of course, then everybody's always thinking that their violence is justified, because remember what those other guys did, so it's only right, and now we respond in kind. There was a slogan at one point where it was a lefty one, that after so many of the fascist terrorist attacks, there was a slogan that was like, "Pagherete caro, pagherete tutto," which was, you will pay dearly and you'll pay for everything, which was the idea of, you're going to get comeback from this. There's going to be, and there were attacks back, and and the thing again is, nobody wins that game. Nobody. You just get a ton of people killed. But in the end, everybody has their fantasy of how it's going to work out. It's like, what do you think? You're going to wipe out half of the country? It's not going to happen. What you're going to do is you're going to kill hundreds or a few thousand people. There's still going to be millions more on that side. So you haven't even made a dent into the general political outline of the country. Never mind that if you actually did make a dent, you're an insane genocidal maniac, so you have other problems. But on a practical level, you're going nowhere. You know, that violence is really not leading to any conclusive outcome. And I think that's the part where people run into a fantasy. And that's the part where I think in modern situations is even worse, because I think part of it is we live with social media, and whether it's clicks, like power these days is about clicks and views and follows and things like that. And what is the one thing that generates the most response? Anything that's tied to, as the media in general knows, not just social, but the media even before, you get people scared, they will pay attention. What happens when they are scared enough? They get angry. They don't want to be just sad, because sad makes you feel powerless about, especially with the fact that we are facing so many different conditions, really difficult stuff that modern society has no idea how to fix. So the response is, let's find some scapegoat and let's blame all our problems on those guys. We could have a wonderful life if it wasn't for those guys who are ruining it all. It's so much easier to do that than to actually look at the issues and come up with solutions, because some of these don't have easy solution. You know, like today in US, for example, there's a loneliness epidemic that's off the charts. There's like, just a few years ago, which I think the numbers have gone up since then, like 15% of American men say they don't have a single friend. That's an insane percentage. It should be like national emergency over something like that. And of course, nobody knows how to fix it, because our modern society is not something there's a reason why it's going in that direction. So, you know, in the face of all this pressure and challenges with no easy answers, I think the easy answers become, we are kept, our fear engine is kept getting turned on by media and social media. Along with fear, the next step is outrage and anger. And you can only play this game so long before people carry this anger in real life, not just by being unpleasant to deal with their family or friends, but they'll carry it and start shooting at each other. I mean, there have already been so much political violence in US in the past few years, and the trend is clearly going up. So that now you see post Charlie Kirk thing, you see all these calls for violence by even people who are supposedly reasonable or even occupy position.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing that like it's the most normal thing in the world. And I mean, I kid you not, I actually made a couple of posts that were about what we're saying now, essentially the idea that, don't be insane, and nobody wins at this game. This is a terrible idea, this acceptance and glorification of political violence. So, you know, it's the most mellow take you could possibly have. It's nothing that controversial. And I'm getting a bunch of people yelling at me like I'm the enemy, and it's kind of like, Jesus, man.
Yeah.
This is where we're at. This is a problem. And I think that anybody who's amplifying those voices, anybody who's going with it's all those guys' fault, they are the enemy, and not even just have a political critique, but like they are evil and they need to be stopped, well, you're asking for a civil war. And you're not going to like what you get, because
Mm-hmm.
again, nobody is going to like what they get, because the reality of that stuff is not some fantasy where your side will win. That's not how it's going to work out.
Yeah, well, especially because, well, you mentioned the social media angle, and I try to be, for a lot of different reasons, very measured in my how I address these things. You know, to the degree that I'm, you know, public as a writer and podcaster, for a lot of different reasons. But first and foremost, being that like I don't want to inspire, even like, you know, being a part of rhetoric that's going to lead to something
Yep.
unnecessarily violent. And the other thing is, like, I see a lot of I have friends both who are on the left and on the right, and I'm seeing a lot of, like, you know, with Charlie Kirk specifically, like, you know, he deserved it, or like, this is our, you know, our time to, you know, this is a step too far, which to a certain degree I understand, at least emotionally, between that or you know, there's a lot of people are drawing comparisons to, there was a Minnesota state representative
Yeah,
who was assassinated last summer, or another recent example where there was a person who ended up, tragically shooting up a Catholic school in Minnesota.
yeah.
And that case specifically, like, there are, cultural or political identifiers that you could ascribe to this person. But when I looked into it, this is somebody who, was transgender, but they also had like a lot of just contradictory stuff. Like, this was somebody who is like just not well. It was this person's mother's school, was my understanding, that they went to. So clearly this is a person who is very upset, and like they didn't really seem to have a coherent ideology, be it, they're, as of the recording of this podcast, we still don't know enough for me to like really feel like I can comment with authority about what's going on with the person who killed Charlie Kirk. But with any of these examples, or like the person who assassinated this Minnesota state representative, these seem like, and it's, I don't want to say like, oh, well, they're just mentally ill, because obviously like they had been radicalized in some capacity, but in a way that doesn't track to right and left in the sense of like 19th and 20th century conceptions of right and left. It's like these very, which I guess is maybe very American, these very individualized, very personalized narratives that they have. And that's, to me, what is scariest about this, because, in the United States, as you obviously know, we had a civil war where it was like territories against each other with armies, the North and the South. Whereas that's, really kind of atypical for civil wars, especially since the 19th, particularly the 20th century. And I say, when I talk to people about this, no, think of the Italian years of lead, think of like the Irish Republican movement. Look at any given civil war in South America in the 20th century. Like, it's not easy. Our side lines up on this side, your side lines up on that side. Let's shoot each other, and whoever wins is in charge of the country now. It's just going to be this low level violence that, to me, like, ends up reinforcing a lot of the fundamental problems in inequalities that already exist. Because I don't see a lot of this really solving anything other than, and especially if, you mentioned the social media angle, if taken in tandem with the rise of like the surveillance state that is rapidly being built, that, to me, this is what's most concerning about it. And I'm trying to find ways to talk about it that I hope is productive. But that having been said, like, it's also not, it's like, guys, we have to, don't turn on each other. The right and left, we have more in common than we don't. We need to turn against the real enemy, which is, it's banally true, but also it's not super actionable. So it's a frustrating situation to be in, and a difficult line to walk.
It really is. And I mean, there is, because we have a strong emphasis on free speech, and for good reasons. However, part of the problem is that there are people who are exploiting this and creating an empire. I mean, they are merchants of fear, outrage, and they just plant seeds of hatred, and that's how they build their fortunes. And there's a ton of these people who built an entire career on creating hatred for the other, whoever the other is. The right-wingers is because they are the absolute evil in every way. The left, it's the left that's ruining it all. It's the whatever. It's like some group that are the enemy. And, they'll start from partial truths. They'll take a few things that a certain group does. They are like, oh, this is really scary. They'll paint anyone who is vaguely on that side as being one and the same, as supporting the same stuff, which is, again, oversimplifying reality. And then they'll just run this empire of making money by stoking outrage against those guys. These people, in my book, are the ones who have blood on their hands, because they are the ones who are getting the guy who's losing his mind already and radicalizing them to a point where they are not just snarky with their neighbor over politics. They are the ones who are going to pick up a gun and start shooting people. I think it's like anybody who's in that business is a monster, just straight up, because they are profiting on on hatred, and now we're looking at real blood. And I think part of the problem is that up until, and this is where the Charlie Kirk thing comes in and is scary because it's an escalation, is that this in many ways is the first social media murder. And what I mean by that is that, typically when you have political assassination, you have politicians. In some cases, there have been journalists, judges, things like that. This is a guy where, when you look at Charlie Kirk, he's like a political influencer, essentially. He's a guy who was just started by, he's not a journalist in the conventional sense. He's not a, and there have been the growth of all this political influencing that has attracted a lot of attention, and there has been a lot of money to be made in that field. And of course, part of the issue, and Kirk is far from the more extreme. I mean, there are people who are way more extreme in pumping up the hatred level than Kirk ever was, but that they make a living stoking things up. Now I think there's the realization that there are crazy people out there who will shoot you over stuff like this. And this is, I wonder what kind of impact this will have, because on one hand, even more there will be money to be made by stoking hatred. On the other hand, you'll have to start thinking, maybe I need to hire a lot more security if I want to keep playing this game, because if they are shooting Charlie Kirk, they're probably going to shoot, there's going to be the next person on one side, the other one on the other. And clearly, the more extreme you are, the more you'll make money, but more you'll be a target. And I think this is going to reshuffle the cards in terms of how that way of doing politics on social media is going to play out. I'm afraid it's not going to reshuffle them in a good way. But there is this element of, if you want clicks, if you want to make money in that field, you do it by being as outrageous as humanly possible. And now, of course, there's the aspect of, oh, damn, there are real heavy consequences that come with it. There are crazy people who will not just stop at the words, but will turn the words into violence. And it's terrifying. The more terrifying aspect of it all is seeing otherwise normal people begin to bite, to take this bait and run with it. I mean, the stuff that I've read in the last couple of days post Charlie Kirk is beyond terrifying, because you have people with families, people who you run into and they're otherwise normal, who are just advocating political bloodshed like is the only recourse. And I'm just like, this is not healthy at all. Like, we are at a place that's, it feels like we're sitting on this bomb, and people are poking it in every direction. And I'm like, none of you guys are gonna enjoy what happens once the poking gets a little too harder, where things start blowing up. Because again, and this is the delusion that I keep hammering on, nobody will win this game.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you say that, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. How, and I wrote something the other day about how this happened on September 10th, the day before 9/11, and we're 1 year away from a quarter century since 9/11, and it's, to me, it's almost like it's hard to conceptualize how much the United States and the world at large has changed since then. And more broadly speaking, sometimes I wonder, like, the as you probably know, since you're a historian, I often think about the it's sometimes called like the crisis of modernity, like at the end of the like 18th century, like 19th century, and how like basically all of these bonds, traditional social bonds that used to hold people together, used to be like feudalism, what have you. Then you saw like liberal capitalism, fascism, and communism all rise to try to deal with this problem. And like a writer like Francis Fukuyama said at the end of the Soviet Union, or at the end of history, liberal Western democracy has won. This is the best possible version. And it feels like the last decade is really disproving that in a way that I don't really know how to deal with or conceptualize. just because on one level, you talked about in the United States how like freedom of speech and freedom of association, expression, it's such a deep part of our tradition, and it is very important. That having been said, like I do wonder, like how can these things survive when we have tools like social media? Like, I'm not saying it's good or I want it to happen, but is, changes and limitations of free speech inevitable? And like, you also wonder, since, not to get too conspiratorial, but when we're talking about the years of lead in Italy and the strategy of tension, or more broadly speaking, in, my understanding of the Cold War in Europe, or, South America, the Middle East, all over the place, essentially, it was outside agitators from the United States, NATO countries, and the Soviet Union powers. I wonder, like, is this like an internal strategy of tension, or is this just the logical conclusion of our culture and the incentives that we've set up with the media and social media? Because a lot of the times, I think it's easy to look at any of these events in isolation and say, okay, well, this is, to use the term, it's a psyop. This is the CIA doing this, or it's Russian interference. But if you look at it, it's a difference of degree, not of kind, it feels like. And it's something that's really difficult for me to parse out and try to, like, how do I want to frame this? How do I want to look at this? And again, like, part of me wants to be like, I want to be able to do something about it in whatever small way I can. But the other part of me is like, well, it's going to be what it's going to be. I should just protect my friends and family. But that leads me back to what I was saying earlier about the scary part to me when I was reading about the years of lead in Italy, just like the apathy that breeds complacency, which breeds more tyranny, essentially. So I'm not quite sure how to look at these things.
No, I mean, this is a time of this is a perfect time for dictators and cult leaders. Because why? Because we are living in a climate of extreme fear, of extreme fast change, where people barely have time to adapt to the change that's happening, and something else is changing I mean, internet is relatively new, and now we're going to deal with AI. Now jobs are going to disappear left and right. Now there are so many factors at play where we have no clue how to handle them well. And so, of course, what does all this extremely fast change create in people? Create anxiety, create fear, create the fact that the basic conditions, like if you look at even the economic conditions of people who were growing up in the 50s, 60s, or even 70s, and you look at the prospects for people growing up now, are radically different, not in a good way. Mm-hmm. So you have these situations where you have real serious problems that are hard to fix. And so this climate of fear is tied then to finding a scapegoat, is tied to outrage and hate, and it's tied to the fact that people will naturally respond to somebody who comes in with a strong personality or appearing to be strong, saying, don't worry, just follow me, I'll take care of it all, I'll fix all the problems. It's because of those bad guys there, I'll take care of them, and I will bring our nation to glory and do, or not on a political level, it can be at a religious level where I have all the answers, follow me into my cult. I meant spiritual movement. Mm-hmm. And it's perfect because these figures are the reassuring daddy figures that for people who are scared shitless, even though they are not going to admit it because they have to pretend to be strong, the reality is that they are scared shitless or they wouldn't be following dictators and cult leaders. And it's the perfect time for them because there's so much widespread fear that people are going to respond to it. It's that simple. So, which is terrible for the reasons you are saying, because, our ideas about democracy and free society and all of that don't seem to have the strength to stand up to this growth of politically dictatorial tendencies and religiously the religious cult leader type of tendencies. I think that's where we are. And it's extremely obviously is not something that we can sit down now and say, here is the 5 quick steps to fix it all, because it's not that simple at all. Each one of these issues is monstrously complicated. Now, what makes it the most complicated is the fact that rather than having a widespread acknowledgement of saying, look, we are dealing with major challenges, like we can list them all right now, and there's 85 of them, and they are all difficult. Let's roll up our sleeves and figure out how we can tackle them. The standard answer is, oh, it's those guys, it's finding scapegoats, which obviously are not the real problem. That's not what's going to solve those 85 issues, but it gives you the sense that you're doing something about it, where you're not. You're only making things even worse by just having this dissension and fighting, as opposed to actually addressing issues. If you didn't have the enemy that you can accuse of every evil on earth, now you would have to sit down to fix issues, and you would find out very quickly that it's not that easy. And nobody likes to feel powerless. So it's so much better just to blame it on someone else and have this fantasy that if you just got rid of them, then everything would be great. And is, A, delusional, B, dangerous, because it's built on demonizing a huge section of the population. And, if he just was like, okay, let's sit down together and figure out solutions, then at least you would be at ground zero and you can start working on solutions. Here we are at ground -10, because instead it's about let's kill each other rather than deal with the actual issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, especially in the context of social media, because I was one of those people where I was a relatively early adopter of the internet. I was on the internet probably way too young, but before social media and smartphones. And it's another one of those things where the transformation has been so rapid and it happens ramping up exponentially. Yep. And that's one of the things that does seem almost because at the very least, in the United States and the West more broadly, it seems World War II is almost it's taken almost a religious connotation of a founding myth. Any civilization, I think, always has their founding myths, and we always have. I often talk about how World War II has become almost a fictional event to the average American, because there's just so much distance between the actual events and the I sometimes say the marvelization of the events. I sometimes joke that some people think that Schindler's List and Captain America are a documentary, which not literally, but all that to say the lack of moral complexity of the issue. And we like to think, oh, well, if we could just get rid of XYZ leader and figurehead, now their movement will go away, because that's what we did with Hitler, which, and which I would say right off the bat, as we talked about with the Italian fascist situation, that was not the case. If you look at post-war Germany, that was not the case. If you look at, or the post-Soviet Russia, that's not the case. But there is something to okay, these are political movements with parties and groups of people who, at the very least, you can defeat them electorally or militarily. Whereas now, in the context of the social media age, everybody is in their own little world, their own little echo chamber. They're algorithmically generated free core or something, or the Red Guard, pick your ideological aesthetic choice. And it can be so hyper specific that it becomes even harder to actually make change, because at the very least in the 20th century context, you could have combat, you could have elections now. At least I know in the United States, other than the 2020 election, I think only about 2/3 of the United States population that is eligible to votes, and it generally trends down. So
Usually even less. Usually is even like barely over 50%.
yeah. So yeah, maybe we had a high watermark in 2020
Yeah,
for
it varies a little bit from election to
yeah,
election, but it's from like
yeah.
50% to maybe 70 when you're lucky.
Yeah, that sounds about right. In any case, like 2020, I think was like particular, like especially particular circumstances with the pandemic and everything. But again, that makes me wonder, like, is this you talk about like a simulacrum essentially of political change where people are talking about just this insane rhetoric online. But I don't need to say it's only a matter of time till it spills over into real life, because it has been spilling over into real life, continues to do so. And I wonder, like, what type of we need to maybe have more difficult conversations than we're maybe prepared to as a nation, a civilization. I'm talking about the United States specifically because that's where I live. But since post World War II, at least, a lot of politics is, and I don't say this chauvinistically, a lot of world politics is downstream from the US just because of,
Yeah.
as I obviously don't have to tell you, the, post World War II and everything. So, like, do we need to say, okay, do we need to change how speech is on the internet? Do we need to make it so, just straight up across the board, like no calls to violence, no violent rhetoric. It doesn't matter if it's right or left, because that's something I saw in like the discussion of like the Twitter files where like a Matt Taibbi, a journalist, exposed that, and then Elon Musk buys it, and now it's more right wing. So it's never been like violent rhetoric isn't okay. It's this side's violent rhetoric is or isn't okay.
Yeah,
And
of course. And that's the hypocrisy of it all, too, that you see people who are like, no to the violent rhetoric. Except when my side does it, then it's totally cool. It's like, oh, I can't believe they shot Charlie Kirk, but never one word about the Democratic lawmakers murdered, or vice versa. Or, oh my God, the outrage of the Democratic lawmakers murdered. Haha, Charlie Kirk got killed. It's like, have some principles, actually. This is not a team sport, especially because the teams suck. And that's part of the problem. I think part of what you're saying is that, when you're talking about electorally, I think part of the reason why there's this climate of fear and anxiety and anger is because at an electoral level, you never end up with something good. Now, I can have my choices about what I consider less horrible. And I can say, well, it's different if you are horrible 85% of the time versus 130% of the time. But we're not talking about there's a good alternative. Because, the conditions we're looking at, the real shit that's ruining people's lives, doesn't get fixed when there are Democrats in power, doesn't get fixed when there are Republicans in power. It just doesn't get fixed, period. Which is why you see these revolving doors of administration where they vote for one. Oh my God, they really suck. We'll vote for the other. Oh, those guys didn't do shit and they are fairly awful. Okay, let's go back. Oh my God, this was, because there's never a point where actually it works and it's good. Only the most insane partisans will think that anybody on the American political spectrum currently has come up with an administration that works well in the past quite a few years. It's just, and so of course that will generate the, like, what is the one thing that you can all agree on about how the other guys suck? Not how there's a side that you like that has something good, is how the other side is so much worse and they are evil. And the problem is that everybody's right to some degree, because when you look at it, it's like you look at the various sides, I'm like, wow, those guys are awful. Oh my God, this is even worse. It's not a scenario where you see good solutions. You see less awful solution, which again, given the choice, I still think there's a difference between less awful and more awful. But we're not talking about the difference between good and bad. You're talking about the differences of degrees. And I think is that contributes to that sense of powerlessness that makes people more prone to listen to violent rhetoric and things like that, because they are frustrated by the fact that there is no good solution out there. And I think that's where we are.
Yeah, and it's something that's very concerning to me, and I'm curious to especially, with somebody who understands history deeply, but also that I feel like I also like, I think, I've talked to other people who read a lot of history. Like, you're torn between, at least I'm torn between, wow, this is just like XYZ event, or like, because of the the specificities of our time, as well as technology, like this interconnectedness, like this is, we're in open waters. There's not a lot of conceptual references for where we are now. And I sometimes wonder, because like when I was reading about the Years of Lead, for example, like the assassination of like the former PM Aldo Moro, if I apologize if I'm mispronouncing
Yep.
that,
No,
it
that's correct.
it feels like something like that is also inevitable. But I do wonder, like, do you have any insight on that? Because sometimes I hear people talk about how the United States, we're on our way to fascism or communism. And sometimes I understand where
Okay.
it's coming from, but I think that like fascism and communism like have really specific 20th century like political social connotations that were not there. There are parts where it rhymes, but like this is something like categorically different. What do you
Yeah.
think?
I mean, especially, this is very funny. Like, if you look at the idea of communism, if you look at modern US, is like,
Mhm.
tell me that, if you're a right winger, tell me that you don't like the left because of A, B, and C. Fine, maybe you have a point, maybe you don't, but regardless. But to argue that they are communist, are you kidding me? I mean, the Democratic Party is like, by every metric out there, is a center-right party in terms of world
Mhm.
politics. They are in bed with corporations. They are in bed. They are not like some rabid Karl Marx carrying book saying we need to nationalize the economy, and it's like, far from it. They take money the same places where Republicans take money, from the biggest corporations out there. The notion that I remember I remember just hearing people who, they'll say one thing, they'll say another. I'm like, oh, that makes sense, and then they would be like, oh my god, if Kamala Harris had won, we would be in a communist dictatorship. And I'm like, you can't tell but laugh, because it's like, do you know
Mhm.
what communism means? Because it's like, I can have
Yeah.
1,000 reasons to tell you why Kamala Harris sucked as a candidate, but being a communist, do you know what?
He was no Lenin, let's put it that way.
No, it's like,
Yeah.
come on, man, that's just ridiculous. And the ridiculous part is that people believe it. It's like,
Mhm.
words have meaning. And there's a checklist of things that you should have to fit a certain definition. If they don't fit any of them, maybe don't use the word. Maybe the
Mhm.
word doesn't apply here.
Yeah, and I would agree there, especially because that's one of those things that, like, it's like there's a certain unreality to it, because if you read about the conditions like pre-Russian Revolution,
Mhm.
or pre-fascism, there may be certain parts that rhyme, but it's very, very different. I mean, for better or for worse, there has been a significant decline in living standards, and there's an increased precarity, but we are nowhere near that level of poverty or violence. And to I say, that's a really good thing, but also, like, some of it is sometimes relative. Like, nobody's like, well, things are bad, but it's not like, 1920s Germany bad. Or it's
Sure.
not like, it's not like the Czar is
No,
what's the word I'm looking for? Condoning pogroms or something. So
agreed. Agreed.
it, yeah, but
And I
I
think
do
that's
wonder.
why we don't see it, or it hasn't yet. It's slower to kindle the level of violence ramping up, is because most people are going to talk shit on internet, but luckily they have a life and they have other things going on, and maybe start shooting their neighbors is not the best idea ever. And even they realize it on some level, despite on what they say online. Of course, that gap start getting narrow and narrow the more they identify with their online life, and less with the fact that, just come home, watch a TV show, enjoy and relax. It's like, sometimes the old Roman bread and games of keeping the people entertained is not a bad thing if the alternative is having people shoot each other in the street over ideology.
Mhm.
And And you're right that conditions are not as dramatic where people feel like, I have nothing to lose anyway, so screw it. The people who usually do that are people who are far on the where mental health stays. They are people who clearly have serious mental issues more often than not. But of course, as conditions are not great and not getting better, the number of people who may go that route increases over time. And that's part of the concern of where we're at.
Yeah, I do. Because if you were to look at it as like an internal strategy of tension type thing, like there is a certain logic to, well, things are getting materially worse. The United States is kind of on a downturn. Well, we can't provide material comfort and security. What we can do is, allow these social media echo chambers to exist so people can kind of shadow box and periodically let out steam. And I'm kind of agnostic on this theory. There's a part of me that does see parallels to the way that the United States would, use these strategies on other countries.
Yeah.
But also, like, it does just feel like kind of just the natural conclusion of a lot of different aspects of American culture. And it could be, a little column A, a little column B, because at least to me, like you said, like the bread and circuses, if you want to continue to have a nation that's like an economic and military powerhouse, that's the way to do it. But I don't know if it's just like there's a lack of ability or there's just a total crisis of leadership and it's factions that are, fighting internally. So TBD on that one, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, Isra, it's definitely because unfortunately, what you're saying about the letting off steam, unfortunately, doesn't really let off steam. It's almost like it adds up to this internal tension, and the more you vomit out hatred and anger, the more you're actually putting that gas back into the tank, and it increases over and over. So that's where I feel that what we are seeing now is so much the result of social media rhetoric, of people who make a living fanning the flames, some people, as you said, there may be an external motivation in some cases, whereas like if I want to destroy a country, I'm just going to piss off people on one side, people on the other, get them to fight each other, and that works. But then, of course, it doesn't take that much of incentivizing people to get them to hate each other. People do a good job on their own. You just need to give them a push in that direction. So both things are happening at once. There's both people who are clearly using it because it's convenient to them, and then a bunch of people who do it just because it psychologically fits for them. In either scenario, it's a catastrophe, and we are seeing why it's a catastrophe. And again, the kind of calls I've seen for the last couple of days. By the way, all of these before we even knew who the shooter was. Then when we found out who the shooter is, now we still, a couple of days later, don't know what the hell is up with the shooter. If he's just a crazy guy,
there's a lot of weird stuff about this one.
This guy, if he was a hard right-winger who became a left-wing, we have no idea. That is not preventing people from saying we need to go to war against them. Who the hell is them?
Mm-hmm.
What are you talking about? Like, which one of your neighbors are you going to shoot? Are you insane? Are you? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. These people are people who have become insane through the constant hyping of fear on social media and regular media that seem to be thriving on that and making money on that. And is seriously the worst. I mean, some people do it because they themselves feel these emotions. Some people do it cynically because there's clicks and money to be made. And those are seriously the worst people on earth because they are, egging people on, and then they are going to hide behind plausible deniability by saying, me? Never, never stalked in. Somebody decide to shoot their neighbor, that's their thing. I didn't. So there's this process going on, and these I don't know. I found it really depressing over the last couple of days, seeing a lot of people, including people I know, who seem to enthusiastically embrace the notion that political violence is somehow A, inevitable, and B, necessary, that they kind of want it. And I'm just like, seriously, these are people that I sat to dinner with who are now advocating we should, what the hell? Like, where are we at as a society where that's not just the crazy dude on the street corner screaming at the cloud, but it's almost mainstream?
Mm-hmm. It is. It has been very concerning, and I would say it does feel categorically different. But I know we're coming close to the end of our time, so I do want to ask you one of the last questions is do you see a way out of this? Because I think there's been a lot of, is it like a situation of the only way out is through?
No.
Can this be now? What do you think?
I mean, if the only way out is through, the price to pay is so atrociously bad that I really hope not, because there would be so much bloodshed and horror and suffering that is really not the way you want to go. Now, not that the other ways are easy, or by now it's so much pressure built in. Yeah, you need to figure out ways to deflate the pressure, but it's hard. It's not easy. But it has to be about A, rejecting all these bullshit calls for violence, rejecting the stereotyping of the other side, whoever the other side is. You know, it's like not everybody who's on the right think the same. Not everybody who's on the left think the same. Usually the people you hate are a sliver of that side that you don't like. And suddenly, rather than saying, oh, that position that represents 10 to 30% of that side of the political spectrum, now you apply to 100% of that side of the political spectrum. And that's how you make dialogue impossible. That's how you make. So to me, it kind of goes back. I was reading right now, right before hopping on the call with you, I was reading right now the George Washington farewell address when he stepped away from the presidency. And the thing that he hammered on the most was the concept of the incredible danger posed by political factions in US. Part of his argument was there are problems that as individual Americans, we sit down, we try to work together to solve. We may have different opinions, but that's how, you know, you have different opinions to fix a problem about strategy. They are not like you are the enemy and you are a monster. Those are two. And he's arguing the moment you create political factions, nothing good is going to come out, because somebody could come up with the cure for cancer and it would not be universally accepted because it comes from those guys and they are evil, they are the enemy. And I think that is an extremely important point, that this type of factionalism need to be countered at every turn. Which is not to say that you cannot criticize people on one side of politics where you think their ideas are insane, but focus on the policies more than the side. Focus on the specific. Focus on maybe doing A, B, and C is a terrible idea, and this is why. Not doing A, B, and C is a terrible idea because you guys are evil communists or because you guys are the worst fascist in the world. Maybe that's not the right way to frame it, you know, because in one case you are actually denying somebody's humanity and assuming that they are just the ultimate evil. In another case is, okay, we are in a disagreement over policy. Those are two very different ways of approaching things. Disagreement over policy, you can do it and still find a way to reconcile and have dialogue. Disagreement over the nature of who you are, there's nothing to compromise on that. You know, the moment you cast a whole group as you guys are evil, it's done. There's no dialogue left.
Yeah, I think that's a very salient point. And I know we're coming to the end of our time. Do you have any closing thoughts other than that?
No, I mean, not to be negative, but I'm glad I have two passports. Because right now it's not looking great. It's way worse than I mean, I did not have a great forecast based on where politics were heading over the last few years. This is a lot worse than I expected. So this is just a scenario where I'm genuinely worried, which I hardly ever am.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one of the second to last thing I have to ask you then, I'd like to first off say, thank you so much for coming on. Like I said, yeah, I'm a big admirer of your work. So this has been a quite a treat for me. But do you have anything to promote? Are you doing anything? Because you were talking about talking more about these years of Gladio. Is there anything else coming up that you'd like to talk about?
So, I mean, most of my work right now, if you want to have an easy intro, there's a bunch of free Substack essays. So on Substack, the only stuff that's behind the paywall are bonus episodes of my podcast, but all the essays are free. The podcast itself, History on Fire, is freely available everywhere. For people who support on Patreon or on Substack, then they get like usually a bonus episode every month. Other than that, I'm probably going to start a new podcast coming up soon. I think I'm going to do something that's specifically on the history of Rome. So I'm going to run, but that's probably a few months away from happening. So those are the primary things that are going on right now.
Well, I will look forward to that. And so I just have one final question for you. I know this is maybe antithetical to what we've been talking about for the entirety of the podcast, essentially, but I always like to ask every guest, especially when things get doom and gloom, like, what's something that does make you feel, hopeful for the future, or, what's something that what would be something that you think we really need?
I think there's a place in the small range, the range that you can feel and touch, where I tend to not despair over big picture, because even though the big picture may be hard to fix, there are a lot of things you can do on the smaller level where you affect people's lives close to you, where you have an impact, where you can enjoy life, where you don't have to wait for some utopia to materialize and all the conditions of the world to be better, because you're going to be waiting a long time if that's the case, where you can worry about the global and worry about larger conditions while at the same time enjoying something on a smaller scale and find ways to make the smaller scale better and healthier. And I think that's important. I think incidentally, if on a smaller scale people were happier and healthier, they would be less likely to want to start shooting their neighbors and doing horrible things on a larger level. So I think that's always an important. And also, there's a bunch of things in which, as you are saying, conditions today, as shitty as they are so much better than conditions at many points in history. We're not dealing with the Black Plague. We're not dealing with like some invasion where half of the people is going to be squashed and the rest enslaved. We're not dealing, there are so many situations in history that have been so much worse than they are right now. So as unpleasant as the current scenario can look like for good reasons, it's amateur hour compared to the real dark times in history. So I think that's always useful to remember the proportions.
Well, I think that's some great perspective to have. And with that, Daniele, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.